I'm Christina. I'm originally from Owensboro, Kentucky. I worked in the Kentucky room at the Davis County Public Library down there for 8 years. So I've been specializing in Kentucky genealogy for almost 9 years now. So we're going to be discovering your Bluegrass ancestors. We're going to be going through chronologically through Kentucky's history to different records that you can find throughout Kentucky history and different events that occurred that may influence what records you can find and just add context to the lives that your ancestors would have had. So first, to start off, is the myth that Kentucky was only used as a hunting grounds for the Native Americans. This was a myth that was taught even when I was in elementary school back in the 90s and early 2000s. But we know now that this was not true. This was propaganda that was used to lure people into Kentucky to move down there. Kentucky doesn't have any federally recognized nations. There is a state recognized nation of the Southern Cherokee of Kentucky. But as you can see, there are many different nations that lived in Kentucky. Important thing to remember when you're doing Kentucky genealogy are the county formations. Kentucky has 120 counties, which is the fourth most counties in the United States. Originally, it was part of Virginia, and it was called Fincastle, Kentucky, or Kentucky County. But when it was formed in 1792, there were 9 counties. And as I said, today there's 120. And as you can see, they're all pretty small counties. So your ancestors may have appear in different county records without ever actually moving anywhere. So it's always a good idea that if you can't find them in one county, to search the counties next to it and see, and you might have some ancestors that went back and forth. A lot of people lived on the county lines on the borders. And so, as I said, they kind of would go back and forth between the counties on what records to look at. And then a historical atlas of Kentucky counties by Wendell H. Roan is a really good resource that kind of talks about the formation of Kentucky and the different counties and which counties formed from the main counties. So most migration to Kentucky happened very early on in Kentucky history, so the late 1700s, early 1800s. Most of them came from Virginia and Maryland. You'll also see a lot of settlers from Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Tennessee coming to Kentucky. You're not going to see as many New Englanders moving down there, but you will find some. The 2 main routes to Kentucky were either up through the Cumberland Gap, there towards the southeast of Kentucky, and that's where you get the pioneers like Daniel Boone. They went through that way. The other way is to go down the Ohio River on flatboats, and that is why you will find a lot of river towns on the Ohio River, because that is one of the main transportations that they used. So because most of Kentucky's migration occurred in the early parts of the country, you're going to find mostly English, Scots-Irish, Irish, Welsh, and German ancestry. As you can see over in the table on the right, the immigration boom that you get in the 1880s and 1890s from Southern and Central Europe don't really go to Kentucky. These low numbers are pretty standard for Southern states in the United States. If you look at a lot of the data, they just tended to stay away from the South. The later immigrants did. So the earliest Kentucky settlements, as I said, if you think of Daniel Boone, and then you have James Harrod with Harrodsburg, Logan Station, Lexington, Kenton Station, and Louisville. As you can see, they're all mostly there in central Kentucky, and then Louisville's over there on the Ohio River. The settlers who are at these stations have been pretty well documented. There's a lot of history books that have been written about these early forts and settlements. Harrodsburg and Boonesboro are also state parks as well. So one of the big things that you will come across when you're doing genealogy for this early part of Kentucky history are the land grants and warrants. So one of the things you might have heard in your family is that someone came and bought land for their service in the Revolutionary War. And that may be partially true. The Kentucky Land Office has for the last 30 to 40 years worked on organizing and digitizing the land grants and warrants and patents that are in their department. And they've estimated that almost 80% of veterans actually sold their military warrants. So the most common use of these warrants were land speculators. They would go and they would buy 10 100-acre warrants. And then when they would get them surveyed, they'd get them surveyed into one large 1,000-acre piece of land that they would then sell off. And so that was much more common than just a military veteran using their warrant to buy 100 acres. And there are 9 different grants and warrants that were given out pre-Civil War. Which one your ancestor might have had depended on where and when they were granted their warrant. The Virginia land grants and the Old Kentucky grants are the earliest ones, and those are going to include the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War warrants. So the patent process, it's a government process, which means it's going to be unnecessarily complicated, but that also means there's a lot of paperwork with these patents. So to simplify them, the process to 4 steps, you have your warrant, which you can see the top 2 images. And then you would take your warrant in and you basically file your warrant to get an entry saying, yes, I'm going to use this warrant to get land. Then you would have a survey done in the part of the state that was designated depending on what grant and what warrant you were in on. And then you would be given your grant and the deed to the land. As you see, the front of the military warrant, there's going to be a military number on the right corner. This number is going to show up on the deeds and the surveys that you're going to find with the warrant. And on the back of the warrant, if it was sold to someone, this is where you're going to find that information. They're going to write on the back of it who they sold it to. The bottom 2 images on the right, you can see there's a survey that was done using the warrant, because the warrants were not for specific pieces of land. It was just for like 200 acres in this area. And then you kind of had a survey done and kind of picked out where you wanted the land. And on the left, this is the back of the survey. This is someone talking about an affidavit. The man who bought this warrant up here actually died not too long after he bought the warrant. And so this person is stating that he knew this man, dating when and how he died, and that the warrant had passed down to his 2 sons. And they're the ones who he is getting the survey done on behalf of the 2 sons. If you're looking for warrants and patents, the Kentucky Secretary of State has the Land Office Services, and they have created an index where you can find these images. And as I said, this website has been 30 years that they've been working on this. And the images that were on the prior slide, I found from this index. The link is here, and the link will also be in the handout. And you can go there and just look around. You can find out the different requirements for the different warrants or grants. Because not all of them were given for military service. Most of them were given more for like homesteading. So you had to stay for a certain amount of year and, build structures, start crops and that sort of thing to get a grant or a warrant for your piece of land. So one of the major groups of settlers that came to Kentucky in the early part was the League of Catholic Families, and that is what they called themselves. They originated from St. Mary's counties in Maryland, and they were a group of Catholics. They were led by Basil Hayden Sr. of the Basil Hayden Bourbon, and they settled in Pottinger's Creek Settlement in Nelson County. They came together as groups of families because they knew that if they came as families, they would be more likely to get a priest assigned in a parish and a church set up than if it was just, individuals coming in. And so from 1785 to about 1792, every year another group from St. Mary's would move to the area of Nelson, Washington, and Marion counties, and they would settle all around this area. The names that are listed here are not the names of all of the families that moved over, but these are the main ones that do tend to show up the most, and they do tend to marry into each other's families. So if you have Catholic ancestors in Kentucky that go back to this time period, you probably have most of these names floating around in your family tree. And there is a genealogical group called the Marylanders to Kentucky. They're still active. They do conferences. They've written a lot of publications, and they're a really great resource if you want to know more about these settlers. If you're wanting records for them, this area falls under the Archdiocese of Louisville, and they do have an archives that you can contact for records. You can also contact the churches that are there. This is one of those where you need to check when your ancestors were at the church and the county formations. Because as you can see, Nelson County was first, and then Washington County was formed from the northeastern part of Nelson County, and then Marion County was split from the southern part of Washington County. So if you have ancestors that in later years are in Marion County, you will probably find records for them in Washington and Nelson County as well. So when you're looking for early records from this time period pre-Civil War, you're not going to find any like birth or death certificates really. The 1790 and 1800 census were destroyed, so you're not going to find those exact census records, but you will find a lot of tax lists from that time period. And so a lot of the census substitute records that's what those are compiled of the tax lists for the counties. There's also going to be newspapers in this time period, mainly in Louisville and Lexington and the Danville areas. There are a couple of books that are compilations of marriages and obituaries that were reported in the newspapers that can be pretty useful for this time period. Another great resource for this time period are county court records. So land and probate records and marriages, those are all going to be with the county clerk office. If you're looking for divorce records, those were actually granted by acts of legislature until 1849. And then after that, they are filed with the circuit court. Church records are going to be another great resource for you. A lot of churches have sent their records or their archives to the Kentucky Historical Society or the University of Kentucky. The Filson Club is another repository for a lot of church records. And then family Bible records. There are multiple compilations and series of family Bible records that have been published. They are compiled by Kentucky Ancestors or the DAR. So the War of 1812 was pretty pivotal for Kentuckians because, as you can see from the numbers, a lot of Kentuckians served in the War of 1812. Nearly 65% of the qualified Kentuckians served in some capacity, and 65% of the American casualties were Kentuckians themselves. A lot of those resulted from the massacre at the River Raisin. This occurred in January 1813. It was near Detroit, up near the Michigan-Canadian border. There were multiple Kentucky regiments that were stationed up there. They had surrendered to the British forces, but then after they had surrendered, were massacred. There's estimated about 400 that were killed in the initial massacre, and then during the transportation of them afterwards, it's estimated about 30 to 100 were killed after the battle itself. And Remember the River Raisin became a battle cry for the War of 1812, similar to Remember the Alamo during the Mexican War. And the War of 1812 military records, they are held by the National Archives, but you can find those records on Fold 3 and on Family Search as well. And when it comes to Kentucky military records, you can usually find all of those on Fold 3 or Family Search. The Bloody Monday riots were in 1855 on Election Day, and they occurred in Louisville. This was the Know Nothing Party, which were anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. They were stirred by editor George Prentice, who was the editor for the Louisville Courier. On Election Day, the Know Nothing members stood at the polling places and threw rocks and threatened immigrants who tried to show up to vote, so that by around noon, all of the Germans and Irish had pretty much given up on voting. Eventually, the Know Nothing members began rioting, starting in the German neighborhood of Louisville and then to the Irish neighborhood, where they set a row of townhouses on fire and then shot the survivors who tried to flee. The official casualty count is 22 from this. However, Bishop Martin J. Spalding claimed that over 100 Catholics died during the burning of Quinn's Row. These events horrified the country, especially horrified the German immigrants who were in the area, and thousands of them fled Louisville after this. When they wrote back home, they warned people to stay away from Louisville. And the German population before this occurred was estimated to be about 1/3, and it dropped to less than 20% by 1860. Most of the immigrants, when they fled, they went either across the river to southern Indiana, where there were already large German communities. They also went to St. Louis and Cincinnati, again, where areas with large German communities. The Louisville Anzeiger, which was the German language newspaper, wrote a lot about this event, and they also warned people to stay away from Louisville and to move away if possible. And scholars have said that Louisville actually could have been a much larger city if this event had not occurred, because it deterred so much migration to the area. That is why it could have been as big as Philadelphia or New York City. If you want to learn more about this event, the Register for the Kentucky Historical Society and the Filson Club Quarterly both have several articles about it. The University of Louisville Archives also has microfilm of the Louisville Anzeiger, which was the German newspaper which wrote about it as well. So in 1852 is when Kentucky gets its first official vital statistics that are required to be recorded. The Sutton Law passed in January 1852, and it required clergymen, physicians, and midwives to record births, deaths, and marriages. And then those would be sent to the tax assessors and then sent to the auditor's office in Frankfort. It was named for Dr. William N. Sutton, who was a doctor in the Georgetown area, who advocated for these recordings of the vital statistics. These were recorded from 1852 to 1862. However, a lot of counties stopped recording them around April or May of 1861 when the Civil War started. And these records can be found on Ancestry and Family Search under the birth and death records. One thing to note when you're looking at these vital statistics is that you're really going to need to look at the original image if possible, because they are handwritten. And as you can see in this example here, they're handwritten, it's cramped handwriting. And so a lot of times the information does not line up correctly. So you might get, if you look on the example on the slide, the name of the mother is actually cramped to where it's actually one above where it should be. So even if you took a ruler and to be able to read the line, you would still get the wrong mother on there. The correct mother would be the one above. So this is one of those records where the indexing is not quite accurate, and you will need to look at the original image to see what it actually says on there. The other thing to note with these records is they are the first time that the birth and death of enslaved peoples are being recorded. As you can, I don't know if you can see, but in the column that says, it says name of father or owner of slave. So if an enslaved person's information is being recorded, you might not always get a first name and you might not always get a mother's name, but you will get the owner's name on those. So in 1833, Kentucky actually banned the bringing of enslaved people into Kentucky for the sole purpose of selling them. Kentucky did not have the large plantations that you might think of when you think of, the southern plantations. Tobacco is not as labor intensive as the cotton fields were further down south. And so you needed less people working in the fields. Most households tended to have 5 or less enslaved peoples, usually more around 2 or 3. And 2/3 of the farm in the state, as you can see, were actually less than 100 acres. So again, you're not going to need dozens of farm hands to work the farm. So it's actually more profitable to sell any enslaved peoples who you cannot employ, to sell them down the river, which means taking them down the Mississippi River to New Orleans usually to sell them. And it was estimated that 77,000 enslaved people were sold into the Deep South from Kentucky, usually about 2,000 to 3,000 people a year. Woodford County in Kentucky actually had the largest number of enslaved peoples, followed by Henderson, Warren, Todd, Logan, and Christian counties. And those areas in Western Kentucky are where you're going to get the bigger tobacco farms. So if you're looking for ancestors who might have been enslaved, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. The main places you're going to look are going to be for deeds of emancipations or bills of sales. Those are going to be in the deed books. They might also show up in mortgages, in wills, estate inventories, and appraisements. They can also show up in the county court records, and newspaper articles will also talk about, runaway slaves. You can also use the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules. However, those did not record the name of the enslaved person, usually. Whether or not they recorded the name was entirely up to the census taker, and they usually opted not to. I've seen, I think, maybe 1 or 2 counties in Kentucky that actually did this, but those are the exception, not the rule. And so if you're looking at those, you're going to have to focus on the ages, and even then, those are usually going to be guesses on how old a person is. A couple of really good resources is the Borderlands History and Archives in Boone County. And then the Fayette County Clerk's Office is actually digitizing all of their records from the beginning of the county's history in the late 1700s. Fayette County, the county seat is Lexington, and Lexington actually had the largest slave auctions in Kentucky. So a lot of people would go there in order to buy an enslaved person. And so those deeds and all of that are going to be in the Fayette County records. And as I said, they've been partnering with some local groups to digitize all of those records and make them available. So the Civil War, it was a very pivotal moment in Kentucky's history. Kentucky, as a border state, tried to stay neutral, but for the most part remained on the side of the Union. There was a brief time when they were unofficially part of the Confederacy, but for the most part, again, it stayed within the Union. It was never an official Confederate state. As you can see from the numbers, 25,000 to 40,000 men signed up for the Confederate Army, whereas 90,000 to 100,000 signed up for the Union. And 24,000 of those were the newly freed African Americans after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. You also get your militias. Home Guard is the Union and the State Guard is Confederate. So if you're reading newspaper articles, you might see mention of the Home Guard or the State Guard. And there are 3 main Kentucky units that you might see over and over again when you're reading Civil War history in Kentucky, or that you might find your ancestors in. The big one is the Orphan Brigade. This was a Confederate brigade. It got its name. There are 2 stories on how it got its name. One is that its commanders kept dying, so it was kept being orphaned without a commander. The other is that they were considered orphans because they were Confederates from a Union state, and so they could not go back to Kentucky, or they would be arrested for treason. The Partisan Rangers are another big Kentucky Confederate regiment that you might find. They recruited mainly from Oldham and Crittenden counties, and they were regular troops, which basically means they were government-sanctioned guerrillas. And they were led by Brigadier General Adam R. Johnson. And then the other one is the Wild Riders. This was Union. It was the 1st Kentucky Cavalry. It was also called Wolford's Cavalry for their commander, Frank Wolford. A third of those came from Casey County. And the Wild Riders, their main duties were they handled a lot of the guerrilla activity in Kentucky, including John Hunt Morgan. So guerrilla warfare in Kentucky did a lot of damage, and it is something that has been romanticized in the years after the war, especially people like John Hunt Morgan and Champ Ferguson, William Quantrill. However, the guerrillas did a lot of damage, as I said. They destroyed towns, they destroyed crops and farms. You might find battles between people, the guerrillas and citizens. As you can see on the article in the middle, this is actually a small battle between the Home Guard, so the Union militia, and then a group of almost 20 guerrillas that occurred. The thing to remember, though, is that there's not going to be any official military records for guerrilla activity. And so even though this was a battle during the Civil War with the militia and guerrillas, there's not going to be any records for these men that died. You're mostly going to have to look at newspaper articles because they followed the guerrillas throughout the state. And you're also going to have a lot of county histories will also discuss the different guerrilla activity that occurred during the Civil War. The big one that you're going to hear about is John Hunt Morgan. He was a Confederate soldier. He, in 1862 is when he began his guerrilla activity. However, his famous raid was in July 1863, and he actually went north into Indiana, Ohio, against his orders from the Confederate generals. It was about 2,400 men. They destroyed railroad and telegraph lines and seized supplies. And as I mentioned, they were pursued by the Wild Riders. And John Hunt Morgan and his guerrilla activity and raids inspired these smaller groups of men who sometimes were just carrying out petty grievances against neighbors, but calling themselves guerrillas. 22 courthouses in Kentucky were burned during the Civil War. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that all of these counties have lost their records before the Civil War. Some of them were able to save their records, and some of them, they may have only some of their records were destroyed. In some cases, people brought in their own copies of their records to bring in after the courthouse was destroyed if the records were destroyed. Pastors and priests would bring in their records as well to kind of supplement the records that may have been destroyed during that time period. So just because a county is considered a burned county, don't lose hope. There are still other records and ways that you can find information pre-Civil War in those eras. Camp Nelson was established in 1863. It was used as an operating base and it was a supply depot. It was a refugee camp for Eastern Tennessee Unionists who were fleeing the Confederate Army and the guerrilla activity that was going on in Tennessee as well. It was also a contraband camp for slaves who were running away to freedom. During the Civil War, escaped enslaved peoples were classified as contraband by the Union Army, so that way they would not be required to return them back to the enslavers. And in 1863, when the U.S. colored troops were formed, Camp Nelson served as the largest recruitment center in Kentucky. The camp closed down in 1866, but many of the Black refugees who were there at the time stayed there and they formed their own community area. This town appears to have kind of been abandoned by the early 1900s. The records for Camp Nelson, including death and internment records, court records, and recruitment records, are all held through the National Archives, and you can view those online through their website. And Camp Nelson was actually made a national park in 2018. So Kentucky was one of the last holdouts on accepting emancipation. The Emancipation Proclamation actually did not apply to Kentucky because it was not officially a Confederate state. And so Kentuckians did not recognize that. Kentucky, they actually they did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1976. So by the end of the war, about 65,000 people were still enslaved, and they would not be freed legally until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. For former enslaved people who wanted to join the U.S. colored troops, you had to be a free person in order to do that. So before they could join, they would have to be emancipated and then join the Army. And in 1864, the U.S. government offered compensation for emancipation to Kentuckians. However, they refused that. Later on, again, when they were offered this in 1866, they took it up. However, by 1867, they stopped compensating people. And so you will find the paperwork there. It is there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that anyone received any money. And if you're looking for these claims, they're going to be found with the soldiers' paperwork. Most of those are going to be found on Ancestry. And these compensation claims will have some biographical information. The one on the screen there, it talks about how the soldier Marion Thurman had been born on his farm and the former enslaver knew his mother. And so you can get some good information from those. And in Western Kentucky, one of the things that's unique to the area are the August 8th celebrations. These are very similar to the Juneteenth celebrations. There's two stories behind the origin of the August 8th celebrations. One is that August 8th, 1863 is when Western Kentucky learned about the Emancipation Proclamation. Again, it did not apply to Kentuckians. However, many enslaved people did believe that it applied to them, and so they celebrate Emancipation Day on that day. August 8th, 1863 is also when Andrew Johnson freed his enslaved peoples. So it's also celebrated in parts of central Tennessee. Russellville and Logan County, Paducah, Allensville and Todd County, and Hopkinsville all do pretty big celebrations every year. And it's something that as Juneteenth has kind of become more popular in the last few years, or more nationally known, these August 8th celebrations have also gained more recognition as well. So the Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1865. They were established in the former Confederate states, the border states, so Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. And they were also in Cincinnati, Evansville, Indiana, and St. Louis. And they offered various services such as issuing rations and clothing. They helped establish schools and businesses. They legalized the marriages because before the Civil War, enslaved people, their marriages were not legally recognized. And so you may find marriages within the Freedmen's Bureau where people are saying, we have been living as husband and wife for 10 years or on there. And they also helped lost family members. One example is I read one of someone's son who their enslaver's son had gone off to the army and taken the enslaved person's son with them. And they're writing after the Civil War, trying to find out what happened to their son. They also handled disputes, and they helped people get military pensions. Kentucky originally fell under the Tennessee superintendent. However, in 1866, they formed their own kind of division within the Freedmen's Bureau. So if you're looking for records before 1866, they may be under the Tennessee one. And these records can be found on Family Search. However, they're not indexed, so you will need to figure out what field office they may have been under. Those are usually going to be the largest city that it's near, and then search through those records one by one. So the decades after the Civil War in Kentucky it was really a time of chaos. 20,000 soldiers, Kentucky soldiers, died in the war. Land value was decreased. Many people's homes and crops were destroyed by the guerrillas, or possibly as well by the army. The educational system had been set back. You also see a leveling of the social classes because many of the former elites, their wealth relied on enslaved labor, and without it, they no longer had that wealth. This was a time of vigilantism. People distrusted the legal system because they distrusted the government in general. Kentucky was under martial law for most of the Civil War, and many people were dissatisfied with how the government officials at the time handled different situations. They felt that they let the guerrillas do too much damage. They felt they should have stopped them sooner. And so there's a lot of distrust in the government after the Civil War in Kentucky. You also have regulators who were essentially Klan members under a different name. And as you get moonshiners, vote buying. This is also when you get the feuds, like the Hatfield and McCoys, those start to gain national recognition. A lot of the negative stereotypes that you hear about Kentucky today, a lot of those originated during this time period. So you might find a lot of stories like this of people just kind of taking the law into their own hands. This is a time period of lynch mobs. And so newspaper articles are going to be a good source for you, because during this time, you're going to find a lot of people who have been displaced by the Civil War. So you're going to find families moving around. There's going to be widows remarrying, either because their husband died during the Civil War, or their husband may have survived the Civil War, but he had injuries or illnesses that lasted with him, and he may not have lived as long as he would have if he didn't have those injuries or that prior illness. And so you might find widows marrying multiple times during this time period. You're also going to have relatives and households all kind of combining into one household as well. And so this was a time period of inconsistent record keeping, again, partially because there's this distrust in the government. You're not going to want to spend a day away from your farm, traveling to the courthouse to file a birth or a death when you don't even trust a government that's taking that information anyway. And you're also going to find that some family records may have been destroyed during the Civil War, or if they're moving around, those records were destroyed as well. So again, newspaper articles are going to be a really good source for this time period. County court records as well. Again, county clerk's office in Kentucky has most of the records that you will have information you're looking for. Deeds are a really good source of information. Kentucky deeds tend to cover a range of things. You can find a whole bunch of stuff in the deeds. You can find divorces in the deeds where maybe the couple didn't want to go through litigation, but they want to separate anyway. And so they're separating their assets and through the deeds. The local histories in the illustrated atlases, those were popular in the 1870s and 1880s. Those are going to be really good sources of information as well. You do, as with newspaper articles, have to kind of remember that take them with a grain of salt. However, with these local histories, when people are giving their biographical information, they're going back only a generation or two, not usually more than that. And so you can kind of trust those a little bit more. There was an attempt from 1874 to 1878 to bring back the keeping of vital statistics. As you can see, the form looks almost exactly as the same as the one from the 1850s, but the counties didn't really cooperate. People, again, didn't really want to cooperate with this. And so they ended it in 1878. What records that were kept from 1878 to 1910 depended on the county. Some counties did keep consistent record keeping, and some counties may have for like a year or two in the 1890s, and that's it. It depended entirely on the county itself. So if you don't know, you will have to contact someone in that county to find out what records they did keep during that time period. In 1910, they created the Bureau of Vital Statistics, and this is when they began recording official birth and death certificates. These records are all kept in the Office of Vital Statistics in Frankfort, Kentucky. If you're looking for birth information, you can only find index information. It does give the mother's name, and you can get the certificate number, but you're not going to get any more information than that from the indexes. And then their death records you can find up through 1965 on Ancestry. However, they have released the 66 and 67 death certificates to various institutions around Kentucky. I know the Kentucky room in the Davis County Library, where I used to work, has the 1966 and 67 death certificates on a thumb drive. So you can contact them if you're looking for death certificates from that time period. You can also, again, order the records from the Office of Vital Statistics. The index information and the death certificates can be found on Ancestry and on Family Search. So one of the main crops that were grown in Kentucky historically and still today is tobacco. Many people in Kentucky were tobacco farmers. It is the main occupation of people in Kentucky are farmers, and they're going to have their small tobacco farms. So many people were tobacco farmers that actually the price of tobacco dropped because there was so much on the market. And at the time, there was only the American Tobacco Company. And this is when the tobacco wars began. The Planters Protective Association was formed in opposition to the American Tobacco Company. And then groups or members of the PPA formed the Night Riders, or the Silent Brigade, which is what they called themselves sometimes. And they went around and they set fire to crops and barns. They beat and sometimes killed farmers who were not part of the PPA. They attacked the ATC agents and destroyed their equipment and raided warehouses. The big ones were in Trenton, Tennessee, and in Princeton and in Hopkinsville. And this was a time of from 1904 to 1909 when the tobacco wars were taking place. This was a time of a lot of fear for farmers. There are stories of farmers who would sit up at night, watching their crops with their rifles or their guns to protect them from the night riders. The prices eventually rose back up in 1909 because the members of the PPA refused to put their tobacco on the market. And so their not participating actually allowed the prices to rise again. And once prices rose, the PPA dissolved fairly quickly afterwards. The Kentucky Historical Commission at the Kentucky Historical Society has a lot of oral histories of people talking about their experiences with the Night Riders and the Black Patch Wars. A lot of them were children of farmers who remember, watching their fathers stay up at night guarding their crops and that other things. So those are a really great resource if you want to hear some firsthand accounts of the tobacco wars. The other thing you might think of when you think of Kentucky is coal mining. And the common assumption is that coal mining is primarily from Eastern Kentucky. It is actually from Western Kentucky. Western Kentucky served as the main source of Kentucky coal until 1912. Hopkins County was the largest producer of coal until that time period. This is because there was a lack of transportation in Eastern Kentucky. There were not the roads to handle the trucks and all of the mining and stuff were not built in Eastern Kentucky until 1911. And this is when you start getting the push towards the eastern coal fields and you start getting more and more coal mines opening in that area. The peak mine employment in Kentucky was 1949. As I said, Hopkins County is usually the largest producer for Western Kentucky, Pike and Harlan counties for Eastern Kentucky. The 1970s are actually when you're going to see your highest levels of production of coal, and this is due to the surface mining that began happening in Western Kentucky, especially in Muhlenberg counties. There are multiple coal strikes that occurred in the 1900s. The Harlan County War took place from 1931 to 1939. There's the United Mine Workers strike in 1959. And then there was the Brookside strike in Harlan, 1973. And this was actually documented in the film Harlan County, USA. It was a documentary that was released in 1976. And these are the biggest strikes that happened. However, you're going to find information on lots of smaller strikes that happened throughout the various counties. I believe Ohio County had some coal strikes that happened during the 1920s. If you want information on the strikes or your ancestors who may have been coal miners, there are newspaper articles. In census records, you will find people who are living in the coal camps. So if your ancestor is a miner and everyone on the sheet is a miner, if you look at the top of the census sheet, it's probably going to be a coal camp. A lot of those smaller coal camps don't really exist anymore. Kentucky government has the Kentucky Coal Mine Accident Index, and this is an index of all of the coal mines accidents that occurred in the 18 and 1900s, and it lists the person and when it happened. And then county historical societies or local history museums are going to be your best bet on finding records. As you can see, with the peak mine employment being 1949, a lot of the employment records are not going to be available to the public due to privacy reasons, because a lot of them are going to be considered too recent history. But a lot of those records did end up with historical societies or museums. So one thing I've noticed doing Kentucky genealogy for so long is that Kentuckians really like to go out of state to get married, especially the ones on the Ohio River. The big places to go were Shawneetown, Illinois, New Albany if you're in Louisville, Rockport, Indiana. I was told by someone who worked in the county clerks at Rockport that at least half of the marriages in Rockport were Davis County Kentuckians. Up in the Covington area, you're going to get people going to Cincinnati. And then on the Tennessee border, you're going to see a lot of people going to Nashville. I don't know as much about Eastern Kentucky, but based on what is located near them, if you can't find someone's marriage in those areas, I would look at Huntington, West Virginia, or Knoxville, Tennessee. And another thing to keep in mind is that African American marriages were actually kept in their own separate books from 1866 to 1914. 1915 is when they're going to be integrated and all of the marriages are going to be kept in the same book. So in 2022, the Kentucky State Legislature passed an act requiring county clerks to digitize their records. They have to create an online portal for electronic filing of recorded instruments. And this was something that came about because of COVID. And so by June 30th of this year, they have to have records back to 1994 available. And by June 30th, 2026, they have to have records between 1966 and 1994 available as well. And recorded instruments, they mean documents like deeds, mortgages, wills, marriages. Basically, every record the county clerk has to be digitized. A lot of the counties are using this eClick system where you can find their records. Some counties have it free where you can create an account for free to view the records, and then some are setting up a paywall where you have to get a subscription or pay to view the records. It varies by county. And if you're looking for more resources in Kentucky, you can always contact us here in the Genealogy Center. There are also multiple societies in Kentucky that you can contact. I would say start by finding the local library in the county that you're looking at and calling them and see. A lot of them have genealogy, their own genealogy centers or their departments. Even the ones that are too small to really have their own department or genealogy center, they will usually know someone in the community who does genealogy research, or they'll know if there's a group there that maybe isn't widely known. And then the county courthouses, the bigger ones they might have an archives that you can contact, and the smaller ones, it might just be one person at the courthouse that you can contact.
We do have questions for you. Someone's asking, how do I find my parents' marriage license if I do not know the Kentucky county?
If you don't know the county itself, even if you know an area, just start looking in the counties that way. There may be, I think there are a couple of resources that are just listing of Kentucky marriages. I think there are some Kentucky marriage books that are statewide that you can look at as well. I do believe we have some of them here at the Genealogy Center.
Someone else is asking about their second great grandfather who moved from Indiana to Perry County, Kentucky. He died in 1933, and on his death certificate it says that he was buried in Shipley Cemetery, which sounds like the family cemetery. So she's wanting to know how she might go about finding this burial location.
There are a lot of cemetery record books. A lot of societies during the 60s and 70s did these cemetery books where they went around hoarding headstones and stuff. And some of those will have the smaller cemeteries that maybe you can't find now. And they will list instructions on how to get to them. So if you can find the cemetery record books for that county, that's a good resource. Deeds. If you look at the deeds, a lot of them, if there's a family graveyard, they will have in the description of the land an exception for the family cemetery. So if you look at the deeds, you can see if it mentions a family cemetery, and then you can trace the deeds to kind of find out where it is today. And again, you can view, depending on the time period, you may be able to view a lot of those deeds now online.
Someone says that it sounds like they've heard that their ancestors had land in Kentucky, and she's asking how to find out the county. So I'm not sure if she might know a general area of the state that they were from, but wondering if you have any suggestions.
If you can figure out an area, even if it's just like Western Kentucky versus Eastern Kentucky, that will help. There is a book of like the grants and warrants and stuff that were granted back that I discussed at the beginning of the presentation. But again, you'd have to know if it was something granted in that time period. If it was after that, I don't think there's like a statewide index of deeds or anything like that.
We have a question from Holly, and she is asking if you could only travel to one of the archival institutions like UK, Kentucky Historical Society, which one would you choose and why?
I would start with the Kentucky Historical Society just because they're going to have more statewide stuff. And also it's geared as a research center, like the UK Special Collections. It's a special collections that they have there. So it's not necessarily a full-fledged archive research center. I would start with the Kentucky Historical Society and then you can look at the special collections for like Western Kentucky or the University of Kentucky to see if they have what you have. But yeah, I would start at the Kentucky Historical Society.
This one says, I have ancestors who moved from Maryland to Kentucky. Says they lived in Moorhead, Lytton, and Devil's Head. I know he was a farmer, but one of his sons she has no records for other than the 1850 census, and he's listed on the children's death certificates. Do you have any suggestions for that one?
Church records, see if you know what denomination they were. If you look at the kids and see if they're in that area, if there are churches that they go to, see if you can find church records that way. Before that, deeds, looking at the land records, I think is probably going to be your best bet that way. Land records and then any other county court records.
Thank you for presenting, and thank you to everybody for attending today. And again, if you would like a copy of the chat, or if you have any additional questions, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info.